Hello, this is SK Williams, and this is the 10th video I've made and uploaded to VidMe. But in many ways, it's the first video that I have made for VidMe, because it's the first one that I've made that is going to have real content on it. Of course, I did do one that was a bit longer than normal. That was actually meant to be the 9th video I uploaded, and if you watch that video, it even says it's the 9th one. And to be fair, it was the 9th one I uploaded. Kind of. I began uploading the video, the Blessed Bee test, which is on my channel if you want to see it, and then left. I went to visit my mother. And when I got back, I assumed it was up, and I posted the other two and put them on a scheduled timer, without even looking, because I was tired. And then when I checked on the other two, I found out that the Blessed Bee video was still uploading. There was some sort of weird glitch, so I deleted it and re-uploaded it. So technically the Blessed Bee is the 9th video, and this is the 10th. But this one's different. This one's different even than the science, philosophy, religion primer. Whereas the primer was, in fact, thoughts and reflections about something, I made it when I was tired. It was right after I got back from my visit with my mother, and I just rambled into a microphone. I feel way fresher now, and my mind is much clearer. I'm hoping that that one actually doesn't ruin my reputation on this channel, to be honest with you, because it was a bit of a mess. But this one is a little clearer. I don't have a well-defined script that I'm just reading off of, but I do have some clear talking points that I have on a card that I would like to address. And that is bad logic on the internet. You see bad logic all over the place, and it's especially egregious when it comes to the important topics that you're not supposed to bring up at the dinner table. Or that would be politics and religion. These things seem to create such a partisan atmosphere, and people are so invested in the discussions that they often won't listen to what you actually have to say and fit everything into a specific paradigm. And this is problematic because sometimes you'll make an argument and the other person will respond to your argument with a stock argument, but the stock argument doesn't really address what you've actually said. The stock argument is instead an argument that counters what someone like you is supposed to say, what they think someone like you is saying. While this actually happens in more than just science and religion, these are the topics that I see it in the most, where it is the most clear. A good example of that would be the other day on an internet forum. I was talking to someone, and for the sake of this video, I'm going to give him a pseudonym. His pseudonym will be Tommy. That isn't his username that he was corresponding with me on, and I don't really know his real name. For all I know, the name he gave me was his real name. It sounded like a real name, but it didn't have to be, and it doesn't really matter. I'm calling him Tommy. Now, Tommy was talking to me, and he was trying to convince me that all of Christian apologetics had been debunked and proven to be irrational. I didn't really want to go into that argument because that wasn't the point I was originally making, but he pointed me to a group of YouTubers who had made videos that debunked all of Christianity. People like Logic and United Citizen X, and I think a guy named Quinlon or something along those lines. It doesn't really matter. The point being made was we got into this discussion. And at one point in the discussion, he kept insisting that he would only believe in things on evidence, that atheists only believed in things based on evidence. And I told him I didn't really think that was true, and it is in fact a very arrogant proposition. Because not only do atheists often believe things without evidence, but even the most hardcore atheist will often be blinded by an ideological belief system about something they just want to be true, and will believe it without any real evidence to back it up. And I used as an example Richard Dawkins' argument that religious people who are scientists compartmentalize. They separate their religious beliefs from their scientific thinking. When they do science, they never think about their religious ideas and keep them sequestered in their mind, and when they are engaged in religious thought or religious activity such as a worship service or private prayer, they never allow their scientific thinking to interfere. For if they ever subjected their religious thinking to scientific scrutiny, their religion would collapse. Science and religion are naturally incompatible hostile forces. Everyone knows this. And as a result, scientists who are religious must compartmentalize. I pointed out that Dawkins doesn't actually have evidence that this is true. The only basis that Dawkins uses for his claim is the a priori assumption that science and religion are opposing forces. This assumption, actually, is not supported itself. It's a well-known trope. It is a commonly held belief in our society, but it's also one that Dawkins doesn't bother to establish. It's simply taken for granted that it actually is true. But what's more, and this is probably the more important part here, even if science and religion were opposing and hostile forces, this fact alone does not automatically mean religious people who enter the sciences must compartmentalize. There are actually other alternate explanations for how someone can be religious and still work in the sciences besides compartmentalization, even accepting the conflict thesis. And again, the conflict thesis is itself not something that is actually proven. In fact, most historians of science, philosophers, and even scientists have abandoned the conflict model a very long time ago. So really, Dawkins' assumption that a religious person who is in the science must compartmentalize isn't really based on anything other than Richard Dawkins' own prejudices. Well, it didn't take Tommy very long to reply. He told me that I was stupid for trying to prove that science and religion were not hostile forces by pointing to religious people who are scientists. Atheists don't argue that scientists are always rational. Rather, atheists are arguing that someone can be rational in one area and irrational in another. Just because someone holds irrational beliefs, such as being religious, doesn't mean that they are incapable of being rational at any other point. So my entire argument was garbage. This was an argument I had heard before, and I had seen it in print before, and I know it's not original to Tommy. But it also has nothing to do with what I said. I wasn't using the existence of religious scientists to prove that science and religion were not hostile to each other. I was simply pointing out that Dawkins' assertion that they compartmentalize is not backed by any evidence. Now, it's possible that Tommy just misheard or misunderstood my argument, sure. But this was the third time he misunderstood my argument, and the third time he responded to something I said with a stock rebuttal that I had already seen. And that's precisely the topic of this video. That often, you can reply to someone. You can tell someone what you believe and why. You can make an argument for it. But if they believe that you're a type of person, and they have in their mind the arguments that the type of person you are makes certain arguments, then it doesn't really matter what you've told them. they will assume that what you're saying is one of the stock arguments that they already know someone like you makes, and they already have a stock reply to when someone like you makes that argument. They're really only listening to a handful of key terms. Like Tommy. Tommy had heard of Dawkins' compartmentalization comment about religious people who are in the sciences, and he had heard about how religious people might object to Dawkins and how to debunk them. So when I came along, and I'm obviously a religious person because I'm arguing against atheism, well, golly gee willikers. That must mean I'm using this argument, argument 108, and he has rebuttal 108. And it didn't really matter what my real argument was. My real argument was that Dawkins asserted things without evidence. So, in fact, did United Citizen X in his video series about how the philosophical failings of Christian apologetics were. United Citizen X's first video made a lot of assertions that he made without providing any evidence for. For example, he claimed that no one has ever converted to Christianity due to apologetics. And that's not why apologetics exists, according to United Citizen X, anyway. Apologetics exists to provide a flimsy rationalization to keep people who already believe in. People who are already emotionally invested and are therefore gullible enough to believe it because they want to. Religious organizations, or churches specifically, only use apologetics to make certain that religious people do not leave Christianity. And they do this because there's a lot of money to be made in religion. Religious bodies are fabulously wealthy. And besides that, they also get political power. But they would have no political power or wealth if people got educated and started thinking for themselves. They would realize religion is all bunk and leave it. So they use apologetics to make certain that their gullible idiot slaves remain obedient to them and give them money. The problem with this is he provided literally no evidence for any of his assertions. He provided no evidence that no one had ever converted to Christianity due to apologetics, nor did he provide evidence that apologetics only exists to keep people within Christianity, or that churches only use it because they need to gain money and power. That churches need to... The only way churches get money is to part money from gullible people, and that they also do it to maintain political power. And in fact, I find his claims very hard to believe. You see, the average clergyman in America, for example, makes less money than other people with equivalent educations. For every megachurch pastor making millions of dollars, you'll have that other guy who's preaching on Sunday for free. Or that guy who is a full-time pastor at a Methodist church, but is only making about $30,000 a year, or possibly less. Why are they doing it? It's obvious that they're not simply gullible idiots who give money to the church. They're being paid by the church. But it's equally obvious that they're not doing it to get fabulously wealthy, since they're not. You could argue that the denominations do. But other than the usual go-tos, like how fabulously wealthy the Catholic Church is, it doesn't really make much sense. For instance, I grew up in the Churches of Christ. For those listening, I'm just going to ask this one question. How much money do you think the central headquarters that governs the Church of Christ denomination makes? I'll let you think about that for a minute. How much money does the denomination raise for its central government? Now that you've thought about it for a moment, I'll let you know the answer. The Churches of Christ have no central governing authority. Each church in the Church of Christ is autonomous. Each one is run at a local level by a council of elders. The preacher is not the most important person in a Church of Christ governmental scheme. The elders are. And the elders are nothing more than the men of the congregation. They held business meetings, usually once a month, to decide where the money goes. There is no single Church of Christ member who gets to decide where the money goes. Many Church of Christ preachers preach for free. They don't get money. Nor do the elders get a paycheck. They all work for free. This idea that religious bodies only exist to con people into giving them money, and so that they can gain political power, is obviously not true. And maybe if the Churches of Christ were some unique exception, I could see it, but they're not. There's plenty of small denominations that run basically the same way, and there are plenty of non-denominational churches that are just running on that way too. Religious institutions don't exist just to bilk global people out of money and to gain political power. That's just nonsense. What United Citizen X said was nonsense, and he provided literally no evidence. And yet, because he's an atheist, we are supposed to see him as basing all of his arguments on evidence. I didn't really listen to any of his other videos. He had little cartoons where he put Carl Sagan and Richard Dawkins' face on little cartoon bodies, and he had William Lane Craig there, but I knew which direction he was going, and it didn't really impress me. But that's the point. Tommy thought United Citizen X disproved all of Christian apologetics in just 10 videos, with each video being about 10 minutes long. Because Tommy believes that Christianity is a simplified, is a fairy tale. It is simple. Christianity does not have a deep intellectual tradition. It's just a simple story that idiots believe. I don't care if you're an atheist or not. That's not the point of this video. The reality is, though, that Christianity does have a deep and long-ranging intellectual tradition, and you cannot debunk all of apologetics in about an hour and a half. Especially if 3 of your videos, and going by the title, that's about right, don't even deal with Christian apologetics, but make excuses for atheism, like his video titled That Atheism a Null Hypothesis, where he's obviously going to argue that atheists have no burden of proof, and that you should always start from a position of atheism. That's not an argument that disproves any apologetics argument, but it's one I've heard before. And that's kind of the problem I have. You see, I didn't make an argument Tommy was aware of, but he already knows all of Christian apologetics has been debunked because he's seen United Citizen X's videos. And he kept insisting, because it is the mythos of atheism that atheists are rational, look at all the evidence, that he wasn't making a priori assumptions. He was making a posteriori assumptions. He was lying, though, and he was lying to himself. He's not looking at all the evidence and coming to a rational conclusion. He's looking for things that feed his own prejudices. And it's obvious he wasn't listening to my arguments. He was shoehorning them into the standard Christian arguments that atheist websites told him Christians use. And it really blinded him to what was going on. Now, atheists are by no means the only people who do this. In fact, as these debates go, Christians do the same thing. There are plenty of Christians out there who will misrepresent or misunderstand atheist arguments because they have spent all of their time listening to specific apologists, and then they've built up this paradigm in their mind about how atheists operate, and they will simply hear a stock standard atheist argument, even if the atheist isn't making that argument. But that in no way makes it better, just because both sides of that debate have people who commit the same fallacies doesn't make one side somehow exonerated. With that said, this sort of thing actually happens in politics as well. A good example is former President Barack Obama. I've chosen him over President Trump because while just as many bad arguments have been raised by people who attack President Trump, as he is still currently president, people's passions are a little higher. So I'm hoping that people's passions have cooled to Obama since he's been gone for 9 months now. When I make this video, he's been gone for 9 months. You may be listening to it far in the future. The point is, he's gone. When President Obama took office, certain conservative elements in the United States belittled him to no end and attacked him on everything he did, and even attacked his ability to be president legally, claiming that he was not a natural-born citizen. They also said he was a Muslim and that he supported Islamic terrorism. And they would often try and support this with, say, a video clip where he said, "My Muslim faith," but it was out of context, of course. And the argument that he wasn't a natural-born citizen is another good example of being blinded by your ideology and not looking at the facts. It's obvious that Barack Obama was born of an American mother, and no one contests that, and that means he would have inherited American citizenship. In addition, he was born in Hawaii, although they kept insisting he was born in Kenya. Well, he wasn't. And I'm not saying that because I'm some sort of liberal who supported Obama. I'm just saying it for the same reason Tommy made his arguments. And in fact, you can see this on the other side. George W. Bush, many liberals were quick to condemn everything he did, and many of them believed nonsense about him. Like, there's this famous quote that people attributed to George W. Bush, where he said the Constitution was just a GD piece of paper. Of course, the quote serves an important purpose in making Bush a villain. Americans revere the Constitution, and the president is supposed to protect the Constitution and ensure its execution. He is bound by it. Americans have this religious connection to the Constitution. It is this sacred document that presidents must protect and serve. So naturally, this evil, vile George W. Bush was dismissing the very thing that defined what it meant to be an American. Of course, he never actually said that. There is no evidence whatsoever that he ever uttered those words. But a lot of liberals picked up the quote and ran with it. And the same thing happened with Sarah Palin. A Saturday Night Live sketch starring Tina Fey had her, portraying Palin, of course, say, "I can see Russia from my house." And it was a good laugh. I'm not going to blast Tina Fey for that. She's her job. She's a comedian, and it was funny for its context. But some people attributed that quote to the actual Sarah Palin and used it to prove what an idiot she was. They used a Saturday Night Live comedy sketch to prove that Sarah Palin was a moron. And they believed it because they wanted to believe it. You see this with quite a lot of things. You see it with historical discussions as well. America's founding fathers are remembered as paragons of moral virtue, even though if you read their biographies, you realize that they were not just men who weren't as saintly as people have made them out to be. That would be understandable, but they weren't even moral men or good men. Meanwhile, King George III, The man we call a tyrant was a moral man. But we don't want to hear that. It goes against our narrative, you see. And that's kind of the point. A lot of times, people become more emotionally invested in their mythologies, and they don't really care what the truth is anymore. This is especially pernicious with the atheist community because it prides itself on its rationality and logic, when in reality it's just as ideologically driven as the others. It's harder for the atheist community to admit this, and thus harder for it to temper it. But the atheist community is, of course, no more guilty of it than other people. And again, I'm not saying all atheists are doing this, just certain ones. The really vocal ones, mainly. And that's sort of the interesting point about this problem, though. If you're not going to really listen to what the other people are saying, and are simply going to respond with stock arguments, and if you're not going to look at the facts, but are simply going to look for facts that support your narrative, then you're not really addressing the topic that's being discussed, or looking at reality in an objective way. You're just building a castle in the sky. And I think that's possibly one of the most dangerous things that people can do. And yet it's one of the most common things you see done. And I'm not really sure what the solution to this would be. People should learn to examine their thoughts better and admit their biases and put them into check. But I don't think that will happen. Especially, of course, with the atheist community, since the whole logic and reason myth has taken over. But it's something I think that should be at least considered. I don't really have much else to add to this, so I think I'll be signing off. Thank you, God bless, and goodbye.